Who is piloting the UAPs or UFOs constantly seen in our skies? Where are they from? Why are they here? How long have they been here? What is their mission on planet Earth? Do they come in peace, or do they have more sinister motives? Join Mad Mark as he uncovers the answers to these questions and many more of the mysteries that puzzle us all on Who Are the Aliens? The history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth. And now, here's Mad Mark.
Today's episode, Do the Gods Really Fly? Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of Who Are the Aliens? The history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth. I, of course, am Mad Mark, and before I begin, just a quick reminder to please like, share, and comment. It helps so much. I would also like to mention that I have created a new Facebook page for this show. I've put a link down in the show description, so please go over and follow me over there. I'm hoping that this will become a place where we can all gather to discuss each episode and where you can voice your comments and questions, so please check that out. Today we resume our studies of Zecharia Sitchin's first book, The 12th Planet, published by Stein and Day in 1976. We are up to Chapter 5, and we are going to start off this chapter by discussing deities and their ability to fly. We have all seen drawings or paintings or statues of ancient deities or angels that depict them with wings. If you're an ancient artist with absolutely no knowledge of technology, how are you going to portray the fact that some or all of your deities had the capability of flight? Well, the easiest way to do that, and thus the method most commonly used, was to portray them with wings. Did these deities actually have wings protruding from their backs like a bird? No, they had craft, which gave them the ability to soar through the heavens, travel vast distances quickly, or lead an army into battle. But rather than attempting to depict a complicated craft of which you had zero understanding of what it even was, you would simply paint, draw, or carve that person with wings. Now, there are several instances where the actual crafts were painted, drawn, or carved in stone, but overall, it was simply much easier and understood by others of that time to simply depict them with wings. There were occasions when these crafts used by these deities were actually depicted. In the Hindu Vedas, we see examples of the crafts known as vimanas. These were flying chariots or palaces used by gods such as Indra and Kubera. There are also carvings made by the Mayans that depict flying craft, and they can also be found in certain Egyptian hieroglyphics. But these were more the exception than the rule, and so most ancient artisans simply gave their deities wings, and the Sumerian and Akkadian texts leave no doubt as to the fact that their deities were able to roam Earth's skies and ascend into the heavens. Clay figures found at Sumerian sites and believed to be some 5,500 years old depict the upper part of various deities wearing conical helmets with elliptical visors or goggles. A horde of such figures were found at Tel Brak, a prehistoric site on the Kheber River, where Ezekiel saw the divine chariot millennia later. Speaking of Ezekiel and his sighting, Eric von Daniken, in his 1968 book Chariots of the Gods, interpreted that entire episode as nothing more than a description of an alien spacecraft or shuttle, which many of us believe to be the case. However, in his 1974 book, The Spaceships of Ezekiel, Joseph Blumrich, the chief of the Systems Layout Branch of NASA, set out to disprove von Daniken's hypothesis. But after a thorough examination, he too became convinced that Ezekiel had indeed witnessed a spacecraft. Blumrich drew detailed drawings of the spacecraft from Ezekiel's description and included technical specifications in his book. According to von Daniken, and I quote, "The spaceship that Ezekiel saw was not a mothership with which you can move from star to star. It was more of a space shuttle. In other words, the type of craft used by the Anunnaki on Earth and housed in their spaceports, which I will get to a bit later, that were used to transport these deities back and forth to their motherships up in space." Von Daniken goes on to say, "I read the story of Ezekiel in its original Hebrew form, and in that form the word God never appears in the text. In Hebrew, Ezekiel described the craft as the splendor of the highest. The word God was put in later by the translators." Then Ezekiel goes on to say that the splendor of the highest arrived a second time, and this time the hand of the highest put him on the throne. In my view, he was then sitting in the co-pilot's chair. And then he describes how the craft started up. He says, "And the hand of the highest pressed on my chest because he feels the G-force as the ship accelerated." He does not know where he was taken to because he claims, "I was taken to a very high mountain." He looks down and he sees something like a city, and in the center of the city there was a building that looked something like a temple. The craft hovers over the temple and then slowly lowers itself down into it. And Ezekiel realizes at that moment that the noise of the wings is getting louder because now the sound echo of the craft's engine is bouncing off the walls as they descend. The craft comes to a stop. Everyone gets out, and suddenly a glittering being appears, probably wearing some sort of a metallic spacesuit, and he hands Ezekiel some sort of a measuring device, and he orders him to measure the entire building. And Ezekiel answers back, "Why? Why should I measure this temple?" And the glittering man answers back, "That is the reason that we brought you here." You see, Ezekiel was an Israelite priest, and these beings knew that Ezekiel would document this encounter as a religious or godly experience and write it all down in his people's religious texts, because religious texts are rarely destroyed. They are handed down from generation to generation and revered as holy. Even the measurements of the building would be included, and they were. And they knew that one day, when man had developed enough technology to be able to take to the skies and understand space travel, that there was a good chance that these ancient texts would be re-examined and seen for what they actually were: contact with extraterrestrial beings and crafts, which is exactly what people such as Zecharia Sitchin, Eric von Daniken, and many others have been trying to do now for over 70 years, and on down to me right here and right now with this show. So, Ezekiel sets out to measuring the entire building, and all of these measurements can be found in the Bible. A German engineer by the name of Hans Herbert Bayer read these measurements in the Bible and decided to find out if this was fantasy or if it could actually be real. So, he started to calculate everything according to Ezekiel's measurements, and the result was a building that resembled a football stadium. So, then Bayer met with von Daniken and showed him the scale model that he had built of this building, and I asked him if he had ever heard of Joseph Blumrich of NASA, who had built the craft according to Ezekiel's description. I brought these two gentlemen together with their two scale models, and the spacecraft fit perfectly into the building that Bayer had built from Ezekiel's measurements, thereby proving that Ezekiel's experience was with nothing more than a spacecraft and a spaceport, not with the creator of the universe. Now, one of the things that von Daniken describes in that story is the shiny metallic clothing worn by the pilot and the people within the spaceport. There were also objects which had to be worn whenever one of these deities wanted to travel to the heavens, in other words, to the mothership and beyond. And these are thought to be some sort of divine power objects. Inanna Ishtar, who was one of the pantheon of 12 gods, was known to make occasional trips to visit Anu at his celestial abode. She explained that she could take such journeys because Enlil himself fastened the divine attire about my body. An early Sumerian ruler who was sometimes invited by the gods to ascend to the heavens was named Enmi-dur-Anki, a name which literally translates to ruler whose me connects heaven and earth. An inscription by King Nebuchadnezzar II describing the reconstruction of a special pavilion for Marduk's celestial chariot stated that it was part of the fortified house of the 7 Mes of heaven and earth. Marduk, being one of Enki's sons, was another of the pantheon of 12, a very important one indeed, and one that we will be talking about a lot in future episodes. And we will also be taking a deep dive into exactly what these Mes are in future episodes as well. Another term used in conjunction with crafts or spaceflight was Mu and Shem. These words were often used to describe sky vehicles, and at no time was this more prominent than the well-known biblical story of the Tower of Babel. If you read this story in the Bible, as I have done many times through the years, it really makes no sense. Why should God, the creator of the universe, get so unbelievably irritated that men were trying to build a tower to heaven? I mean, seriously, how high could it have been given the technology of the human race at that time, right? Was he somehow threatened by that? Really? And another great question that always puzzled me was, why would human beings even attempt such a ridiculous feat in the first place? They didn't exactly have the brains of scholars in those days, but even they would have had to realize that their efforts were futile. They would never be able to get that tower high enough to reach heaven. And another thing, how did an omnipotent God not know that this tower was being built until he actually laid eyes on it? Isn't he supposed to see and know everything? I just thought I would ask. Anyway, to make a long story short, this tale always raised more questions in me than it ever answered. Why would an omnipotent God, creator of the universe, seer and knower of all, be so damned upset that a bunch of lowly humans are attempting to build a tower to heaven, a feat of which he would have known would fail, unless, of course, that wasn't what really happened at all. You have to remember that when the Bible was written and then translated many times over, man knew nothing of space travel. Hell, the Wright brothers hadn't even made the first flight at Kitty Hawk yet. Obviously, we have buildings today that are much taller than these guys could have ever hoped to attain, and yet no God ever comes down and complains about them. Nope, whenever these scholars ran across something being described that they could not understand, well, it just had to be God. We'll just call it God and leave it at that. So, with all that in mind, let's re-examine the story of the Tower of Babel and see if maybe we can get it right this time. In the 11th chapter of Genesis, we read that the humans were attempting to build a tower and raise a Shem, which generations of scholars translated to mean that these people were attempting to build a tower in order to make a name for themselves, which, as I stated earlier, is completely ridiculous. If these passages had been translated properly, it should have read that the people were attempting to build a spaceport similar to the ones that the gods used. Then, all they would need to do is somehow attract a Shem or spacecraft, which would also be no small feat, and then they would be able to soar through the heavens like the gods. Now, we will learn in future episodes that that is not exactly what was actually going on in Babel, but for now, let's stick with the book. So, then the Lord comes down, sees what they're attempting to build, and says, "Behold, all are as one people, with one language, and this is just the beginning of their undertakings. Now anything which they will scheme to do shall no longer be impossible for them." And then the Lord continues talking in plural, obviously speaking to some colleagues, which I guess we're just supposed to once again ignore, Come, let us go down and confound their language, so that they may not understand each other's speech. The traditional translation of Shem as name has kept this tale completely unintelligible from day one. Why were the ancient citizens of Babel attempting this impossible task simply to make a name for themselves? Why was the name then to be placed upon a tower whose top shall reach the heavens? If all these people were trying to do was to make a reputation for themselves, why did it upset the Lord so much? Why was the raising of a name deemed by this deity, who was in fact Enlil, but we will discuss that more at a later date, to be a feat after which anything that they scheme to do shall no longer be impossible for them? The traditional translations are definitely insufficient to explain why the Lord found it necessary to enlist the help of other unnamed deities in order to put an end to what the humans were doing. The answers become quite obvious once we replace the mistranslated name with the term sky-borne vehicle. Both the Mesopotamian texts and the biblical account reach the same conclusion. Flying machines were meant for the gods and not for mankind. Humans were allowed to reach the heavenly abode only upon the expressed wishes of the gods. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, these people were not actually attempting to build a spaceport. Well, technically they were, but not for their own use. They were doing all of this under the direction and instructions of another of these gods, a god who for now will remain anonymous, but I will give you a couple of hints. Hint number one, this is all taking place in Babylon. Remember that. And hint number two, this god is well known for his many attempts to acquire a spaceport for his own use by any means necessary. Okay, that is enough for now. As I said, we will cover this story in more detail in the future, but for now, back to the book. But are there any other ancient accounts of man's ascent to the heavens or of space flights? Funny you should ask, because yes, there certainly are. The Old Testament, for instance, records several instances when mortals were allowed to travel to the heavens. The first example of such an event as this is in the story of Enoch. Now, Enoch lived in the time before the Great Flood. He was a patriarch whom God had befriended and who had walked with the Lord. He was the seventh patriarch in the bloodline of Adam and the great-grandfather of Noah/Zeusudra. Now, the fifth chapter in the book of Genesis, if you've ever read it, it is quite boring. Lists the genealogy of all the patriarchs in this bloodline and the ages at which they died, all except for Enoch, who was gone, for the Lord had taken him heavenward to escape mortality here on earth. The Sumerian texts also speak of several other humans who were allowed to visit the heavenly realms. One of these was Adapa, the first Adamu, or model man, ever created by Enki. To him Enki had given wisdom, but eternal life he had not given him. Many years later, Enki decided to prevent Adapa's mortal end by providing him with a Shem, or craft, with which he could reach the heavenly realm of Anu, so that he may partake in the water of life and the bread of life. Some of the humans who were allowed to the heavenly realms were sent back to earth, while others were allowed to remain. Such was the case with Utnapishtim/Zeusudra/Noah of the Bible, and it was to find this Mesopotamian Noah and obtain from him the secrets of the tree of life that set the Sumerian king of Uruk, Gilgamesh, out on his historic journey. Whether or not you have ever read the Epic of Gilgamesh, just about everyone has heard of it at one time or another. These exploits of Gilgamesh are considered to be Mesopotamian fiction, literary tales of faith such as Job in the Bible. But they do contain many references to the topics that we have been discussing today, which just goes to prove that these flying crafts of the gods were common knowledge to everyone in those days. Gilgamesh was born the son of a mortal man and a divine mother. He was considered to be 2/3 god and 1/3 mortal, and that fact prompted him to seek escape from the death that was the fate of all mortals. Before I go any further, I have one quick note that I would like to insert here. We've talked about it a couple times today, and it will come up again on later episodes. These gods were not and are not immortal. They only seem that way because they live a very long life compared to humans. I'll go deeper into the explanations for all of that when we discuss it in the future. But for now, I will compare it to a fly. That's right, to a fly who only lives 28 days if he's lucky. Humans seem immortal. We've all heard the tale of the fly who points to a man and tells his son that humans are immortal because his father had told him tales of that very same human living there when he was a boy. Humans are not immortal. We just seem that way to flies or any other critter that doesn't live as long as we do. It's the same principle as when comparing our existence to that of these gods. So to continue, Gilgamesh knows that he will not be immortal because he has human blood in him, and he desperately wants to correct that situation. The history of his people had taught him that one of his own forefathers, Utnapishtim, Ziusudra, Noah, had escaped his fate by being taken to the heavenly abode by the gods. So Gilgamesh decides to seek a way to also reach the heavens and obtain the secrets of eternal life from his ancestor. The distant journey Gilgamesh undertook was to the land of Tilmoon, where he could raise a Shem for himself. He was accompanied on his quest by his comrade Enkidu. Upon finally reaching their destination, the pair discover that it was a restricted zone and was protected by awesome guards. Being weary and sleepy, the pair decide to rest overnight before continuing on the next day. Let me just pause here to say that it appears that although people of that time may have been aware of these Shems, these flying crafts of the gods, but they were understandably ignorant of the procedures involved in launching one of them. Several times during the night, Gilgamesh is awakened by strange sights and sounds that he cannot understand. Things such as the heavens shrieked and the earth boomed, obviously caused by the rockets igniting and the shaking of the ground. He goes on to say that daylight failed, darkness came, lightning flashed. Here he's describing the clouds of smoke followed by the brightness of the ignited engines showing through. He goes on to describe a flame shot up and it rained death. This could only be the ship streaking heavenward, followed by the debris and ash falling back down to the ground. Now, I realize that I am skipping most of the story here, but I think it's best if you go ahead and read it for yourselves. What I am most interested in, what truly cannot be ignored, are the aerospace aspects of this story. The Shem that Gilgamesh set out to acquire in order to reach Utnapishtim in the heavenly realm is obviously a spacecraft or rocket, and the launching of one is what he witnessed overnight as he was trying to sleep. The rockets were housed inside of a mountain, and the area was a well-guarded restricted zone. Obviously, no pictorial depiction of what Gilgamesh actually saw exists. But a drawing found in the tomb of an Egyptian governor clearly shows a rocket head above ground with the shaft of the rocket stored underground in some sort of silo. One final note regarding the Epic of Gilgamesh is that Tilmoon, the destination of Gilgamesh on his journey to acquire a Shem, literally translates to land of the missiles. There can be no doubt that when referring to these deities as gods of heaven and earth, ancient man knew that they were beings who had come to earth from elsewhere. Even the small amount of evidence that we have learned thus far indicates that these deities were flesh and blood beings who literally came down to earth from the heavens. Even the ancient authors of the biblical Old Testament, or Torah, who reworked history to revolve around just one God, found it necessary to acknowledge the existence of these beings in Earth's early years. Surprised to hear that? Then read your Bible. The verses I am referring to have confounded both theologians and translators alike, and it can all be found at the beginning of chapter 6 of Genesis. It can be found between the verses reviewing the spread of mankind through the generations following Adam and God's disenchantment with mankind preceding the Great Flood. Now, before I go any further, I want to take a brief pause because if you're like me, and I know you are, your radar went up a moment ago when I made the statement, even the ancient authors of the biblical Old Testament, or Torah, who reworked history to revolve around just one God, found it necessary to acknowledge the existence of these beings in Earth's early years. Yes, they definitely did that. They reworked the Bible to revolve around just one God, and there was a reason for that. And that is a topic that I will be discussing in great detail in future shows, so you're not going to want to be missing any episodes. I just thought that I would mention that, sort of a teaser, if you will. So, to quote the Bible, the sons of the gods saw the daughters of man, that they were good, and they took them for wives, all of which they chose. So the implications here and the parallels to the Sumerian texts are unmistakable as we read on. The Nephilim were upon the earth in those days, and thereafter too, when the sons of the gods cohabited with the daughters of the Adam, and they bore children unto them. They were the mighty ones of eternity, the people of the Shem. Now, you can still find certain versions of the Bible where it says giants upon the earth instead of Nephilim, but this was a mistake in the translation, and most of them have reverted back to using the term Nephilim. The people of the Shem has been mistranslated into the people who have a name, and thus the people of renown, which I have shown is a mistranslation and completely ridiculous. It obviously should read the people of the rockets. Now, you may be asking yourself what the term Nephilim means exactly. Well, according to the Semitic root NFL, it means to be cast down, or those who were cast down upon the earth. Biblical scholars and theologians have mostly avoided or ignored these troublesome verses, and it's pretty obvious why. However, a noted Jewish biblical commentator of the 19th century, Mal Bim, stated that in ancient times the rulers of countries were the sons of the deities who arrived upon the earth from the heavens. They ruled the earth and married wives from among the daughters of man, and their offspring included heroes and mighty ones, princes and sovereigns. These stories were of the sons of the deities who in earliest times fell down from the heavens to the earth. That is why they called themselves Nephilim, those who fell down. Regardless of the repercussions to theology, the original meaning of these verses cannot be escaped. The sons of the gods who came to earth from the heavens were the Nephilim, and the Nephilim were the people of the Shem, the people of the rocket ships. Well, that is certainly a lot to take in and a good place to stop for this episode. So, what all have we learned today? Well, we learned a lot about flight, how many deities were portrayed as having wings to identify the fact that they had the capability of flight. We learned about Ezekiel and his encounters with crafts and beings from the heavens. We learned about Joseph Blumrich recreating the craft seen by Ezekiel, and about Hans Herbert Baer recreating the building that Ezekiel was told to measure, and about how these two fit perfectly together once recreated in the same scale. We studied the Tower of Babel and how that entire story makes no sense until you realize that the humans were attempting to build a launching pad or spaceport for a rocket or a Shem. We learned about the Epic of Gilgamesh and how, in that story, the hero witnesses the launching of such a craft into space. And we discussed the term Nephilim and the true meaning of that term, those who fell down from the heavens upon the earth. And we have so much more to cover and learn. I'm Mad Mark, and I sincerely hope that you have enjoyed this episode. If so, please tell your friends and help spread the word. I also wish to remind everyone that listening to this podcast is no excuse to not read the book that we have been discussing here, The 12th Planet by Zecharia Sitchin. It is an amazing work, and I am leaving out much information in order to keep the show flowing properly, so please do yourselves a favor and read that book. Today we have taken another step in our ongoing journey to discover the truth. I promise you that things will get more and more interesting the further we delve into this topic of who are the aliens, the history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth. Bye for now.
You've been listening to Who Are the Aliens? The History of the Anunnaki on Planet Earth with your host, Mad Mark. Join us again on our next program when Mad Mark will once again uncover the answers to the mysteries that puzzle mankind.